Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar hosted by the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. We're collaborating today with the Tyndall Centre at the University of East Anglia. The webinar is part of the Newton-funded PhD exchange program between the University of East Anglia and the University of Cape Town, which we coordinate here at UCT and Tyndall coordinates for East Anglia. If you are a PhD student at either UCT or UEA and you're interested in taking part in the exchange, please have a look out for information on either of our websites. In today's webinar, we're pleased to welcome Marcello Vichi, who is an Associate Professor here at the Department of Oceanography and Director of the Marine Research Institute. Marcello will be talking about recent research he has done on the Southern Ocean in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean sectors, focusing on current knowledge gaps and the role of sea ice. So everyone has your microphone muted. If you do have any questions along the way, if you could please type these in that chat box on the side, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation. We may not be able to take all questions if we run out of time, but we will do our best. And we'll also make the presentation available to you all at the end. And it will be recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Marcello. Marcello, if you could set yourself up there with your camera.
I already started the camera. Can you hear me? Can you see the camera? Start sharing. Okay, confirming, you can see me? And the screen as well. I hope so. So I'm going to start. Eve, can you please confirm that everything is fine on your side? Yes, thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcello Vichi. I actually started working here at the Department of Oceanography 3 years ago, and I always wanted to work in the Southern Ocean in my former life, let's say this. And I've been a climate modeler for half of my scientific career and a coastal oceanographer before that. And when I started preparing this presentation and was requested to talk about these kind of arguments, I actually realized that there is a need to give a quite detailed overview of the functioning of the Southern Ocean and in terms and how it participates to the climate. Because if there is one region in the ocean that is very much affecting the entire climate, well, that one is the Southern Ocean. And understanding climate is, everyone would say that it's complicated, but actually my take on that is that we are all familiar with climate. We don't really know how local climatic implications and impacts may actually reverberate and how they do participate to the bigger picture. This is exactly the concept about the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is one dynamical region that does connect for physiographical conditions, for its own geography, and for the dynamical features that connect the entire ocean to the climate system. So I'd like to thank before starting my students that have been helping me to understand more about the functioning of the Southern Ocean, as well as my collaborator from CSIR, and particularly all the scientists who spend a lot of time in front of computers and finding bugs and problems to produce the climate simulations that I'm gonna use quite a lot during my presentation. So I'd like to start from two major considerations and thinking about the Southern Ocean as a place where heat can be stored. This concept is pretty well known to oceanographers, and it is called the ocean heat content. It is the amount of heat really measuring the temperature and summing up all the temperature in the ocean in various parts of the ocean as a volume. So you know how much heat is contained at one moment in time in the ocean. What we are interested in is how much heat has been stored in the ocean, in the various regions, in the various basins in the ocean. And there is a recent paper, it actually came out some months ago, from Chang, who's been re-evaluating and reassessing many the observations and the knowledge we have about the temperature in the ocean. These figures are pretty simple to understand by climate scientists. Climate scientists are used to anomalies. They look at differences with respect to a reference state. And in this particular case, the reference is the period 1997 and 1999. And what you see on these three panels is the ocean heat content for the entire 2,000 meters, upper 2,000 meters. We are talking about heat content, so it is an energy. It's expressed in joule. And then it is divided in the upper part, in the surface, and in the lower part, below 700 meters to 2,000 meters. So everything is referenced to the heat content of close to the year 2000, so that is set to 0. And it's showing you that for the period for which we have data, there has been a continuous increase of the heat content in the majority of the basins. The largest portion of this heat is the gray area that you see here, and it's the storage of heat in the southern oceans. Southern oceans here, it means all the sectors south of 30 degrees south. So this is particularly important for those of you who are familiar with the concept of the hiatus, this slowdown in the warming that has been observed starting from 1998. Well, actually, this warming, because people are looking at the atmospheric temperature mostly, while the Earth is a complex system with connected components, and atmosphere and ocean do interact with each other. So much of the heat that has been released by through the anthropogenic perturbation has actually been stored in the ocean. And particularly, if you look at panel B, in the deeper component of the ocean. So below 700 meters, half of the heat has been absorbed in the deeper components of the Southern Ocean. So there is still an ongoing warming in one part. So far for the heat. So the Southern Ocean is acting as a heat capacitor, which is buffering these extra heat produced by the release of gases of anthropogenic origin. And I'm not just talking about CO2 here, but all the greenhouse gases in general. But focusing more on carbon, because that's the one that has been studied the most, which is really a pity because actually all the others definitely would require quite some attention, is carbon. So the Southern Ocean is also an important storage of carbon. And to make this statement, we have to start talking about models. We have to start considering numerical simulations, because the amount of data we have in terms of how much carbon and the complexity of the carbon system in the ocean is something that was elucidated only in the middle of the last century. I mean, from the 1950s on. To have a complete picture of the amount of carbon in the ocean would require a gigantic observational effort. So models do become the major instrument we have, and we will talk a bit more about these later. So if we focus on the left-hand side of this figure here, these three panels, we are using, the author here, De Vries, used model inversions, which is a combination of data and atmospheric model, to measure how much carbon is going into the ocean. So the upper panel is the air-sea carbon flux. You have the storage of anthropogenic carbon in the middle, and then the transport from one basin to another as a function of latitude. So these are zonal means, integrated zonally all along the various longitudes per every latitudinal degree of latitude. As you see, the largest components are still found, just focus on the black curve here, the largest component of the flux and the largest storage occurs south of 30 degrees in the southern hemisphere. So it's again the Southern Ocean that acts as a major storage of carbon, and particularly the Indo-Pacific region has been storing the majority of anthropogenic carbon. The Atlantic, certainly less, but actually the Atlantic is the one with the largest export, with the largest transport equatorwards from the Southern Ocean toward the center of the basin of anthropogenic carbon. This is from actually one single model simulation, and we can look at the results from climate models, ensembles of different climate models, and we'll see later on in less than a minute what are Earth system models more specifically. We see this schematic from Fröhlicher. It's another recent paper from 2015, where we can still see that the majority of the anthropogenic carbon, 43% of the carbon, has actually gone into exchange at the surface of the ocean and stored in the interior of the ocean, just as it happened with the heat. As you can also see, the storage is larger at the closer to the equator, so in the intertropical regions, because of the transport of the general circulation of the ocean. So the Southern Ocean is a rather dynamical region of the global ocean that does require, and actually required, a lot of time to understand what was its structure. And its structure needs to be at least appreciated to a certain extent in order to discriminate the complexity of the various processes at work. This is a kind of famous schematic. All of you who are working already in the Southern Ocean certainly have included this one version of this. Now it's from the year 2000 from SPEAR, one version of this schematic that is showing the major water masses as well as the overturning circulation. The overturning circulation is indicated by the black arrows, and as we see, it is a combination, it is driven by a combination of heat exchanges at the surface, as well as topographic effects and exchanges between the various layers. As a balance, and everything we observe for a sufficiently long amount of period in the ocean, it means that it's at balance with the underlying forces. So as a balance, we find a gigantic current, which is the Antarctic circumpolar current, that determines the location of the polar front, separating the northern component called the subantarctic from the Antarctic zone. So the Antarctic circumpolar current is at equilibrium with the distribution of water masses and the various forces. As we see, there are two major cells, circulation cells, that have been identified in the Southern Ocean. We have this bottom cell, where we see these North Atlantic deep waters that becomes lower circumpolar deep waters and returns, becomes denser, so they sink down because of heat losses occurring closer to the Antarctic continent, and they turn back, it's an overturning, they turn back as Atlantic bottom waters. The upper portion, the upper cell, is comprised of the other circumpolar deep water, also originating from the North Atlantic deep waters, and then returning back as a branch in Antarctic intermediate waters, which sinks down. They are subducted underneath the subtropical front where they are warmer. So the curvy arrows, you shouldn't be, for those of you who are not familiar with the general circulation of the ocean, you have to think, we usually think about a conveyor belt as real currents, but actually momentum, motion, and ocean properties are not transferred as really a conveyor belt, but we have several mechanisms in the ocean that can also occur through more turbulent processes. So this is, for instance, shown here in in the center of this scheme by these curvy arrows that are they mean the transport that occurs through eddy processes, through turbulent processes. I think we have enough oceanography for now. This is the mean picture. So this is what everyone talking about the major structure of the Southern Ocean would start from. But actually the Southern Ocean is not a static thing. This is a dynamic equilibrium, which is largely affected by seasonal processes. So the Southern Ocean is home to one of the largest seasonal events on Earth. And this is linked to the advance and retreat of sea ice, which affects the physics of the ocean, as well as its biology and biogeochemistry. So it participates to these processes and sets these processes that contribute to it. On the right-hand side, you see a figure of the chlorophyll, which is a pigment contained in phytoplankton, that is an indicator of phytoplankton biomass from a summer condition. As you see, in the Atlantic particularly, we have a large spread of, well, some people would say not really large, but actually for an open ocean condition, these concentration in the greenish here that are close to 1 milligrams of chlorophyll per meter cube, they are all spread in a very large area of the Atlantic. And they have quite a scattered distribution in the other regions. How do we know this? How have we come to appreciate the complexity of this distribution, of this spatial distribution, thanks to certain tools that have been made available through the years, and global oceanography and multidisciplinary oceanography, interdisciplinary oceanography have evolved a lot, and particularly in the Southern Ocean because of its remoteness, because of the complexity of capturing information on this area. So what kind of tools we have available? We got observational platforms as well as numerical models. Starting from the observational platforms, we want to capture data that are beyond the pure physical information on temperature, salinity, or density of the ocean. Understanding the role of the Southern Ocean in climate means understanding many other processes that would allow us to discern the complexity of the biogeochemistry. And these means including carbon fluxes, the various forms, the speciation of other chemical building bricks of life like nitrogen, the various production rates, the importance of iron as a limiting element, as a very important limiting element. But not only that, are the trace metals that would allow us to understand the distribution of this component in the ocean, as well as the role of atmosphere. So the atmospheric deposition of these various chemical elements. And that is just looking at one component of it. We want to know how the plankton community responds, which means appreciating the complexity of its composition. And it's a remote place, so it's actually not that simple to acquire seasonal information on this variability. And even limiting to just the carbon content and chlorophyll concentrations, we can't really do much in terms of the continuity of these observations because of the platforms that we have, which are remote sensing. Nowadays, there has been quite a large effort of using all possible combination of remote sensing data to retrieve variables, to retrieve meaningful data from variables through radiometric information or multiple kind of satellite information. We have cruises, and we talk about them at the very end of this presentation, and autonomous platforms. And talking about autonomous platforms, one major advance here in South Africa was actually done by the Southern Ocean Seasonal Cycle Experiment run by Pedro Montero's group at CSIR. It used very advanced robotics and the combination of them and various combination of them to study the seasonal cycle in the focusing on the subantarctic. One of the elements that is being used are the Bio-Argo, which are floats that have a quite peculiar behavior in the ocean. So they actually park at certain, they are floats. They are floats that are passively transported by the currents. So they go with the currents and they are parked at certain density depth. And then at one point they take a very long, from a deep parking position to the surface, a profile, which is then transmitted to a satellite. Not only the physical information can be gathered, but also biogeochemical information, thanks to the Bio-Argo float that have been mostly developed in the Mediterranean. And some of you probably would recognize Villefranche-sur-Mer here in the back. Other autonomous platforms that are not really that new now, because I've been realizing this morning that I was doing my master thesis when the first glider was tested. So it's very close to 20 years now that these very interesting tools are available. And we are still we are still learning from them and from the information that they provide. They are autonomous platforms, so they can last for very long periods, from 2 to 10 months. And the CSIR group has been exploiting their capabilities to the very much to their very limit in several kind of configurations. So they also carry various sensors. They can measure the typical temperature and salinity and pressure conditions, as well as photosynthetically available radiation, dissolved oxygen, fluorescence, and backscattering, which allow us to have proxies of the phytoplankton conditions, of the phytoplankton spatial and temporal distributions. All these data are necessarily scattered. Even if they are getting complex and quite multidisciplinary, they actually still represent drops in the oceans, like one single transect or a combination of transect or one mooring site, or they tend to be aggregated in the major circulation patterns, which is what happens when you have floats that are passively transported. So there is a need to bring together these data with the way the ocean works. And that's what happens with prognostic ocean models, numerical models, and particularly with some of them, like this experiment that was done, this production of data that was done by, it's actually a consortium of people. This one is particularly from the University of California, San Diego, and it's a Southern Ocean State Estimate. What are we talking about here? We're talking about numerical models that resolve the major dynamical equations of the functioning of the physical ocean, but melding them, blending real observation in a dynamical and highly mathematical way. So this allows to integrate information into the rules, the physical rules that are resolved by the model, allowing us to cover gaps and get closer to a proper reconstruction of the oceanic state. The kind of data that are included are several. We got the Argo float we talk about, animal instrumented, in this case with elephant seals. We got CTD rosettes, the expandable bathythermographs that have been used since the 70s and 80s, and all the various satellite products that they all provide different categories of data that are included in data assimilation products like this one. But of course, these ones are limited to the reconstruction of the past. We want to look into the future. We want to know how the Southern Ocean would evolve, and this is done by climate models. And particularly, if we are interested in interdisciplinary components, so in bringing together not only the physical part, but the biochemistry and the biology, these climate models are expanded and they become what are called Earth system models. So they are still numerical models on a grid, like this one. You see an atmospheric grid, an ocean grid that runs also on land. And in the various points, you have dynamical equations, prognostic equations, so they go into the future, they have time involved based on current processes, that allows you to resolve all the physical processes, so the exchange of heat, momentum, and water between ocean and atmosphere, and the atmospheric circulation and oceanic circulation as well. And you have sea ice models, like this one here, that deal with the evolution of the ice-covered portions of the ocean and the formation of these ones, and we'll get more into more details on this. But they also resolve the biogeochemical processes on land, which is the biomass energy, the carbon input, the change in the soil, and the role of the microbial community, and also not to forget the biophysical interactions that occur at the surface at the land surface, but as well as the ocean biogeochemical processes. Now, this cartoon here purely focus on the carbon exchange, but there is actually a nitrogen exchange and a phosphorus exchange that should be taken into account. I'm sure you appreciate the complexity of these little thingy, which are actually not that little, because they do require very complex high-performance computing systems to be run, and they of course have one major limitation, which is the dimension. What's the length scale? So what's the resolution, the spatial resolution, which is so important for climate impacts? We have to resolve the global problem at global scales that are changed by the climatic scales, but actually we are interested in impacts that are local, which means that the resolution needs to be taken into consideration. And we are all interested in increasing resolution to know more details. And the next generation of Earth system models will shift from, this is an example of a grid in the ocean, which is a 2-degree resolution. And I'm kind of sure if I would remove all the latitude and longitudes from this figure, you wouldn't know what we're talking about. So only by increasing the resolution, you can see Cuba, for instance, here, and Florida. So this is clearly telling you that the more resolution is a necessity. The higher resolution is necessary to resolve specific topographic features that are intrinsic in the functioning of the various systems, not only in the atmosphere because of the topography, but also in the ocean because of the interaction with the coastal. But you can understand that the knowledge of the physical processes is sometimes valid at certain scales. And when you move to higher resolution, then you probably need to insert additional knowledge. And this is particularly true in the case of biogeochemistry and ecosystem interaction, where we actually measure the infinitesimally small, and we would like to apply it at larger scale. So when we force our models to resolve higher resolution, higher frequency, and more processes, we have to make ourselves the question, do we know how the system really works? And particularly, how are they already performing? And by increasing resolution, do we go in the proper direction? This is a question that I've been working with for the past 5 to 7 years, and honestly, I must say that I haven't yet come to an end, and that's a nice thing of research. But I'd like to take you towards a rather interesting point about the performances of models in the Southern Ocean to find out gaps. So just as a reminder of what is the circulation, we are mostly going to talk about the subantarctic zone, which is this region here, north of the Antarctic circumpolar current, but also the Antarctic zone. The subantarctic zone is characterized by a very large sink of carbon because of the subduction of these Antarctic intermediate waters. So there is an interest in understanding whether the air-sea or sea-air carbon fluxes are properly represented. And a famous paper from some years ago now from Lenton, actually found out that the seasonal cycle of the carbon flux in the Southern Ocean from biogeochemical models here in the upper part, in the upper panel, and from atmospheric inversion models, doesn't really represent what is our state of knowledge. Please bear in mind that the state of knowledge is also rather uncertain because of the limitation of these of the data collection and data availability from these remote regions. So we are very much comparing models with models when we do this kind of exercise. So it's very important that we keep this in mind, but nevertheless, the information we had was that we are not as yet capable of capturing the seasonality, which is supposed to be a dominant signal in the Southern Ocean, and actually is a dominant signal. So our models, while they are very good in many other regions of the ocean, and of course people may argue that it's not perfect, but actually they are resembling and capable of representing the major seasonal features. In the Southern Ocean, they don't. They get slightly better when data are used to constrain the flux. But in free-running simulation, which is the ones we use for climate models, we are actually not performing very well. And this is another paper from about the same period from ANAV that is showing the seasonal cycle at different bands of latitudes from different Earth system models, which is what I've been presenting before from the last climate model intercomparison project phase 5. These ones are also compared with observational reconstructions. I'm not calling them data here because there is some modeling in terms of the usage of the data that is included. And as you see, if you progress north, just focus the last 4 panels, apart from certain models, but the majority of models seems to cluster around the data. While in the Southern Ocean, from 90 south to 44 south, they are spread all over the place. A work we've been doing here, thanks to a PhD student, Precious Mongwe, have been analyzing the various mechanisms that are responsible for these discrepancies in models. And he's been able to classify them in 2 major groups that are, in one case, is let's focus only here in the center panel where you have the Atlantic Ocean in the subantarctic zone and in the Antarctic zone. And as you see, if you compare with the observations, and now we are talking about slightly better constrained set of observations, the models tend to show amplifications of the seasonal cycles, and this is one group of them, the red group. And we have another one which is out of phase. So these 2 groups have been classified as being more controlled by biological, biogeochemical processes that are changing the carbon concentration, as well as other that are more affected by physical drivers. If we move on in the analysis of the major biases, this is a concept that I tried to introduce in the community some years ago, which I called SOB, because we are unfortunately still sobbing in the sense that many of our biogeochemical models that are meant to simulate the plankton dynamics and phytoplankton particularly, so the primary producers in the global oceans, are still not capable to resolve the major features. And how do we know the features? Here in the bottom panel, we have satellite observations, and again another model that is included to translate these radiometric data, water-leaving irradiance data into chlorophyll concentrations, are indicative of this scattering of this variety of phytoplankton distribution that we observed before in one of the earlier pictures. Now, some of the major biogeochemical models, they are still incapable to reproduce it. Some of them are slightly better, like this one here in the upper right column, but all of them tend to have an overestimation. So this is a tendency, the sobbing, the Southern Ocean bias, that is found in the majority of biogeochemical models when compared with observations. How do we explain this? Why is it there's so much variability in the seasonal cycle in the Southern Ocean? Well, it has been partly explained by a paper some years ago by Sandy Tomala in 2011, where they looked at how much the observed variability from satellite, the observed variability of chlorophyll was linked to a seasonal cycle. So how strong was the seasonal cycle? And this is the percentage of variance which is explained by the climatological seasonal cycle. And as you see, in the Atlantic particularly, we have bands where in some areas like the subtropical region, the seasonal cycle, so from year to year, we observe a kind of similar reproduction of the same features. While in other regions, and this is typical, it's a typical features of the subantarctic, it is not true. The variance explained by the seasonality is so low. So from year to year, what happens inside, within the season, is so varying that dilutes the signal and removes the possibility to capture, the possibility to see such a seasonal cycle. Another analysis that is supporting this one was done by one of our students, and still not published yet, which looked at the cluster analysis of the seasonal cycle features. And as you see, just by looking at the subantarctic, we have different types of, we don't have one single seasonal cycle. So the different regions are characterized by major shifts in how the seasonality of plankton is manifested. For instance, just by looking at, if you look at these light green and dark green, you actually have, like the light green has a late bloom here from November to December, while in the area closer to the subtropical front, we actually have a much earlier bloom, and we have a winter bloom when we move into the subtropics. So how do the model perform? How good are our models in doing it? Well, not much. This is another work currently in preparation, where Mark Haig made a comparison between the various climate models, the Earth system models, and the data. The data are the satellite data, and it's this curve here that you see here with the bloom between November and December and peaking in February. And these are, from the subantarctic zone, these are all the other, what the climate models, how the climate models perform. As you see, they are honestly all over the place. The phenology, which is the response, the timing of the peak of the bloom, the duration of the peak of the bloom, the characteristics of the bloom, as forced by physical drivers, are actually not well constrained in the Southern Ocean. Why is it so difficult? It is difficult because of the complexity, because of the many scales that are involved. And the use of gliders, the use of data, the use of platforms that allow us to sample at a very high frequency without the necessity of being there and transmitting us these information actually allowed us to start assessing and estimating what kind of errors we make when we infer climatological information from few data. So in particularly, Monteiro et al. Focused on the CO2 fluxes, and they found out that actually if you want to reconstruct the mean, the longer term mean, you have to sample at a scale which is smaller than 5 days. The longer the sampling frequency, the sampling period, the lower is the chance of capturing the mean. The same kind of analysis was actually done by another student of ours, Little, that she's been working. Now, this was an analysis done with a glider in mooring mode, working like a mooring site, while when working on a transect glider, she also found a similar thing, that by increasing the subsampling period, you see this range of uncertainty, which is very similar to what you observe in this side here with the difference in partial pressure and the CO2 fluxes as well. This one was done with chlorophyll. So if you want to reconstruct the chlorophyll mean, you actually have to sample the system with a periodicity that is unfortunately much larger than our capability through cruises or other observations. What are the other, just to move on into the other biases, another major bias that is known to climate scientists is in the location of the westerlies. These papers, it's actually a set of papers from 4 years ago, they've been analyzing, this is latitude, you see on the y-axis you have latitude, and on the, on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we got the westerly, so the jet, that is one of the dominant features of the Southern Ocean, the wind jet, the intensity. And this is global. And if we focus in the Atlantic, we actually see the data are in data. It's again a blending of model and data, so they are called the reanalysis. We see that the majority of models tend to have an overestimation of the intensity of the jet, as well as an equatorward bias. This is kind of typical everywhere, and it has been linked to the response of other important features, and particularly to the trends observed in temperature and in the sea ice. The observed trends in the sea ice concentration are actually escaping the capability of our model. What we know at the moment is that there is a significant increase of sea ice in the Weddell Sea regions, as well in the Ross Sea, but we have a reduction, a significant decrease of sea ice concentration in Bellingshausen Sea and Amundsen Sea, so in all the areas surrounding the Antarctic Peninsula. Now, how does the model perform? So this work by Purich analyzed the observed trend in sea ice concentration. This one is scaled per degree of global warming, so it's percentage per degree of global warming, not per decades in this case, and the observed SST trend. Associated to these changes in temperature, to these trends in the sea ice, we have a trend in temperature, which is a cooling. So how the models are performing? Actually, they are not very good in this. All the models tend to have a warming trend, which is spread around the subantarctic zone, and particularly in the Atlantic region. The Atlantic is the area, and the subantarctic more particularly, that has been experiencing in models the largest increase in sea surface temperature, which is not seen in the observations, or at least in the set of observations that we have. And this led to a reduction of sea ice concentration, which is in stark contrast with observations. How is this possible? How do we explain that? This paper went further on by correlating sea ice, sea surface temperature, and wind intensity. And this relationship is particularly evident in summer. So by taking December, January, and February, these are the asterisk here are the data, and this is the mean, the ensemble mean of all the simulation. 87 simulations have been analyzed here. And what we see that there is, the majority of models are in summer are characterized in the region where we have sea surface temperature warming and sea ice extent decrease. Sea ice extent is defined as a sea ice concentration more than 15%, which is the way we measure sea ice area. While currently the observations are putting us in condition of sea surface temperature cooling in terms of trends and sea ice extent increase. This is linked to, if you now do the analysis related to the jet strength trend, so the trend of the speed, the wind speed in the jet region, these two are related, are kind of similar. The models are in the area with the warming and jet weakening, while the jet strengthening, which should have been captured by the model, but only some of them, and not the majority of them, or at least not capturing to this value that is observed, that they are all slightly positive. So all models are capturing this strengthening of the jet intensity, but not the way it should be. And this is in summer, but if you move in winter, we see something similar also for sea surface temperature and the sea ice, but not the same for sea surface temperature and jet. So this is taking us to the importance of a winter condition to fill another gap in our knowledge. So how important is the relationship between the atmosphere and the ocean during winter. Well, this occurs in a special region of the ocean, of the Southern Ocean, which is called the Marginal Ice Zone. The Marginal Ice Zone is the area characterized by sea ice that is not yet consolidated into what we call pack ice. It's an area which we may define to be between 15% of sea ice coverage to 70–80%. But its most important feature is not the coverage, but is the fact that the interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere are not completely dampened. And the kind of interactions we're talking about are the exchanges of momentum, heat, and gases, and particularly the role of waves. So in the Marginal Ice Zone, the feature of the sea ice are largely affected, and particularly in the Southern Ocean, because of the pancake ice formation, are largely affected by meteorological oceanic conditions, met-ocean conditions. So just to give you an idea of how the Atlantic Marginal Ice Zone in the Southern Ocean is, this is the silence you have in the area, and this is courtesy of Marcel Duplessis, and this is our winter voyage from 2015, where we see the wake, and you see that this is the typical configuration of the Marginal Ice Zone, and you can travel 200 kilometers in these conditions of these pancakes of various shape. What we have found at the models have a large variability, a large spread in the Atlantic sector of the location of this marginal zone. And we know that the momentum interaction, so how much motion is inserted into the ocean, strongly depends on the presence of this Marginal Ice Zone, because the wind stress, the drag of the wind on the ocean, is amplified in the presence of flows. And in the Southern Ocean, we have more than 200 kilometers of flows, and this area is actually expanding, which, as we will see in a while. This is an analysis done in 2016, so it's very recent. All the work on the Marginal Ice Zone is very recent. That is showing, here we're looking at June, July, August, so this is the winter and the spring, and we have two different algorithms for reconstructing sea ice concentration from space, from microwave passive data. And we see the Marginal Ice Zone on the left and the consolidated pack ice. So it has been increasing, so this is following, these are the observations. But if you look at the Marginal Ice Zone, in winter, it hasn't been changing more or varying quite a lot around 200 kilometers, but in spring, it has been increasing. So we have a widening of the area where these interactions between the atmosphere and the ocean are largely mediated by the particular features of the sea ice. So measuring the sea ice is now becoming a necessity. Adding more details into our models is very much our next task. We can't improve our knowledge and get better models without going back to the field and taking these kind of measurements. And particularly South Africa is a real opportunity for sea ice research. We got quite good unique position and facilities. We got multiple logistic and scientific trips to Antarctica, thanks to our ministerial departments, and we are still one of the few countries, there are not many anymore, countries of the Antarctic Treaty that conduct winter cruises in recent years. This is certainly an opportunity for expanding a sector, a knowledge sector that in South Africa hasn't been done, unfortunately, sorry, I'm going back to it, okay? So in more than 50 years of Southern Ocean observations, we unfortunately haven't been benefiting, exploiting this knowledge. And many years have gone by without really measuring this information. So just to give you an example, I've been talking about the recent years and the changes. Yes. This is just an overview of the diversity of 3 different winter cruises and the kind of observations we make. The voyages of our ship are actually unique opportunities to record sea ice observation from the Eastern Weddell Sea and Indian Ocean. which is an area with almost no data. And how do I know it? I mean, if we look at the integrated sea ice algae chlorophyll from ice cores, now these are sampling in the sea ice, there is the Indian Ocean sector, which is actually partly an Atlantic sector, has no data at all. And the same happens for the biogeochemistry. You see, almost nothing in these regions. So observations of sea ice concentration, as well as training personnel to understand the human uncertainties of human observers looking at this. This is a work that was done by one of our students, comparing how different observers looked at that, at the sea ice concentration. But we have to face the changes that are currently going on. Just give you another brief example of what happened in December during our last trip to summer trip to Antarctica. And 2016-2017 was a year with the lowest recorded sea ice extent. There's a huge variability in this. What you see here in the upper corner, the year-to-year variability is so large that it's very difficult to discern trends. There's so much interannual variations. And just to give you an idea of the complexity of how it works, I'm just showing you very briefly another movie, which is showing you how quickly, now the ship is standing here, it's not moving, and this is telling you how quickly the various fragments of sea ice go around. And if we move on to another case, which is another interesting one, and then this is at the end, as you can see, we're just looking at movies as with the kids at school. This is another case that is showing how, this is midnight, and it's showing you the formation of sea ice in the early morning, and then it goes away. So this is changing the way the atmosphere and the ocean interacts, and the way there is an exchange of heat and momentum. All these processes occurs at scales that we are not yet resolving. So the future is increasing our capability to record sea ice observations through the automatization of measurements, but particularly to the training. So thanks to collaboration with some of our international partners, we've been able to train some of our students. So for the first time, we had South African sampling using corals, and we are going to do again this winter, which is, as you see now, we're moving between, this is March and this is today. These are the conditions, sea ice condition as of yesterday, and this is the longer term mean, the median edge from 1981-2010. So we are still, this year is still a year with less sea ice with respect to 2016. There was still on average in the variability. But we are moving towards a peak that will happen in September. And particularly, we will be having a trip, a scientific voyage to the Atlantic Indian Marginal Ice Zone to focus more, and this is the kind of work that will be done in the Indian Ocean, in this sector between 0 and 30 east that has no data at all. So I do hope to have another opportunity to come back to you and show the results of our upcoming cruise. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll take some of your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marcello. If anyone has any questions, please could you type them in the chat box. Should be on your screen, or alternatively you can raise your hand. There's a little icon of a person raising your hand. If you have a working microphone, then we can connect you that way. So I see someone's typing a question. Let's see what comes up. Approve. Corinne, so I've given you the mic. Would you like to ask your question? Okay, Corinne, we're not able to hear you. Could you rather type your question in the chat box, please?
Can you hear me now? Oh, very
hi, Corinne.
good.
Yes.
Oh, hello, Marcello. Thank you for your presentation. This is a great overview. Marcello, you mentioned about the chlorophyll bias of the model in the Southern Ocean. And we have looked into this as well.
Yes.
And we
Yes.
find that zooplankton grazing is very important for this bias. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the ecosystem aspect of modeling of the Southern Ocean and how that influences carbon fluxes from your experience.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for this. Thank you so much, Corinne, for this important part. I haven't been. Sorry, can you switch off your microphone? Sorry, can you switch off your microphone because there's. Okay, thank you. Now it's working well. So I've been talking about the amount of data that have been collected in this region, and I haven't been touching upon the other trophic levels, and particularly zooplankton and higher predators. There's a quite huge lack of knowledge about their role, and one of the hypotheses that have been put forward in controlling phytoplankton blooms is actually the role exerted by zooplankton predators, so by the grazing. I must say that to my knowledge, the data on zooplankton, particularly in this area of the subantarctic, where the majority of uncertainties and discrepancies in models is found, is rather large. There haven't been any specific any specific attempt to fill this gap in sampling zooplankton and how active is at the end of winter and starting of spring, because as you have probably found, by changing the role, the pressure of predator can definitely modify the phenology of the bloom. But without data to constrain it, without knowledge of what happens during wintertime, where is the community, what kind of community we are working with, it will be hard to constrain the models and to bring in this additional knowledge. And just to add another thing, unfortunately, in our cruises, we lack these capabilities. So we won't be able, even if we are starting to sample the sea ice during wintertime and the community that is found around it, to know what is the recharging state of the system in preparation for spring, we are not capable to provide enough information. So this is certainly something for future collaborations in case there is an interest from zooplanktologists to carry on an analysis of the samples that we are going to collect.
Okay, thanks, Marcello. I think we have another question coming in, and that'll probably be our last question because we're just about out of time.
Yes, Katie is properly saying that, that we have a UCT PhD that is starting to work on that. So we will be able to fill this gap.
Okay, great. Well, if there are no more questions, then I'd just like to thank you, of course, Marcello, for your time here today, and thank everyone for attending the event. We had a great turnout, and hopefully there'll be more of these collaborations between ourselves and the Tyndall Centre in future. Great.
Yes,
So we'll
thank you
be
so much.
disconnecting now. Thanks again, everyone.